A few minutes ago, I had a discussion with somebody about weather and natural disasters. Okay. Um, Recently, Oklahoma had tornadoes, and probably the biggest disaster that the country dealt with in the last century. Well, not the last century, I misspoke. This century, meaning the 2000s, would be the Hurricane Katrina that hit the Gulf Coast in 2005. Then before that, California, San Francisco, and Oakland had a pretty big earthquake in 1989 just as the World Series was being played. And it just so happened that that year, the two teams in the finals were the Jays, the Giants, and the A's. Oh, I must be tired. Well, the Giants and the A's were the two teams in the finals. And of course, both cities are right across San Francisco Bay, so the earthquake may have affected San Francisco more than Oakland, but Oakland enough that it put the whole thing on ice for a time. Because it's unusual for two teams that close to be in a series, but they're only a few miles apart, and the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge are both, is all that separates them. So, that was, I think, the worst earthquake San Francisco had since 1906. That happened in 89. So that's about 85 years, 83 years of rebuilding, only to have that happen. Now, I know that's a long time, but we're talking about 8 decades to build something that was destroyed in only a couple of hours. And then the same thing happens with the hurricane. Before Katrina, the last one of that magnitude that hit that area was Camille in 1969. And of course, in the Northeast, we really don't have too much that way. We have snowstorms. They're a bit inconvenient. I mean, indirectly, they can cause life loss. Cars can crash. And once in a very rare instance, the snow gets so heavy that it caves in a roof, but that almost never happens. I can't say it never does, but it almost never does. So snowstorms, although they're inconvenient, they're not bad in the grand scheme of things. Floods are bad. The Susquehanna River floods often. All rivers flood. But the Susquehanna has what's called the 36-year flood. It had a very bad flood in 1900, 1936, 1972, and it had one in 2008, but it didn't equal the last three. It didn't equal the last three 36-year floods. It's even debatable if it really happened that year in comparison. It floods. It floods every year. But the damage caused by it had a bigger flood than it usually does in between the 36-year times, but it didn't measure up to any of the 1900, 1936, or 1972. And floods do more damage than people realize, too. They destroy buildings and houses. Concrete walls might survive them, but they're musty and old and stinky once that happens. Drywall is destroyed. And roads and railroad tracks are washed away because the ground under it is washed away and it sinks. And once you see that happens, there's a tremendous amount of weight in pavement and railroad tracks, all these things that are made to support trains and cars. And once the ground underneath them is eroded, train tracks are washed into a 90-degree angle because once the ground underneath it is washed away, the currents of the river can bend that like wire. So, yeah. So it's sometimes when you see the aftermath of a natural disaster, people chase storms and want to see the hurricane or see the tornado. But when you see what's left behind, I wouldn't find that particularly interesting. I would just find it devastating.